Welcome to the DFIRmas podcast. This is a seasonal short series podcast by ArcPoint Forensics, hosted by yours truly, Amy Moles. In this episode, I'm joined by Derek Eiri to discuss digital forensics in the healthcare sector. Derek Eiri is a cybersecurity analyst at a nonprofit integrated healthcare system. In this role, he participates in incident response activities and enhances organizational readiness to collect, examine, analyze, and report on data to minimize disruptions to patient care. Previously, Derek held roles in healthcare compliance, privacy, and information security. He was responsible for investigating allegations of unauthorized access or disclosure of protected health information, detecting and preventing fraud, waste, and abuse, and assessing third-party vendors and technology risk. Derek also volunteers as the secretary for HTCIA's Northern California chapter. In his free time, he tends chickens, cleans corgi hair off everything, and spends quality time with his family. You share a little bit about your journey into digital forensics and incident response and how you got into healthcare.
Sure, absolutely. Just to start out, my name is Derek Eiri. I'm located out in California, and just to throw it out there, everything I say on this podcast is my opinion, in my opinion alone, not a reflection of my employer. But with that said, I didn't start out in digital forensics. In fact, just thinking back on my progress throughout my career, all of my earlier roles were accomplished through opportunity and circumstance. Um, Digital forensics is the only role I aimed for with intent and attained, which was really interesting for me. Early on, I considered law enforcement, being a lawyer, and I thought about being a middle school teacher. It was kind of just a really weird period of going through school and just trying to figure out what I really wanted to do. So I got a bachelor's in psychology, probably one of the most generic degrees you could probably get. And this is right before the great financial crisis. So as soon as I graduated, there weren't a lot of opportunities that were hiring, including state agencies and just private sector, all just in generic fashion. So, but fortunately, I had great friends, a great social network of folks that knew who I was about and know what I did, just as far as characteristics go. And I got lucky with my first role as a court-appointed investigator. And that was
Neat.
predominantly responsible for just being the eyes and ears of the court of investigating and assessing something very serious. Because as a court investigator for probate court, my responsibility was to ascertain whether or not if a conservatorship is warranted. And with court conservatorships in California, you lose a lot of rights as an individual. So there's not a lot of room to get it wrong. In fact, you want to make sure you get the right information the first time around. And it taught me a lot of early lessons on about being able to communicate, writing reports, particularly because it's a legal process where someone's freedom, if you will, albeit they're not be able to articulate that themselves or manages it themselves financially or personally, it's a serious matter. But I did that for about, for several years. And then I had an opportunity to get into healthcare where it was focusing on compliance, privacy, and security. And then my role there was about investigating fraud, waste, abuse, privacy concerns regarding unauthorized or impermissible disclosure of protected health information. And it involved quite a bit of technology at that time as well, with HIPAA and whatnot, basically just protecting and managing the security of PHI. And around that time, I was like thinking, wow, there's a lot of technology stuff that's involved. And I got my first feel for it just by looking at logs of employees' access to medical records. And with logs, you might see something on the screen, but it may not actually represent what their actual actions are. And so your responsibility is to figure that out, make sure that their live actions in real life reflected what it said in the log or vice versa. And then when you see something in the log or access log or the audit trail in an electronic medical record, you go through this investigative process in your mind. It's like, okay, if they did this in the medical record and they did so impermissibly, like they're curious, what are the things they might be doing? Are they looking up names on Google? Are they entering certain things like specific drug medications that they're interested in? things of that nature. And that ties into other computing systems. And I was curious, like, well, how else could you get that information? And so in the organization I worked at the time, they had their own digital forensics team. And I thought, that's really cool. I want to do something like that. But at the time, it appeared unattainable to me because I didn't have a degree in computer sciences or really had a desire to go back to school. And so time went on, started to continue to do my role as a governance, risk, and compliance professional. And then over time, I was reading about other people's path to digital forensics and understanding that you don't necessarily need to learn how to program or have a computer science degree. It was more about just piecing together facts and your observations and really understanding the technology behind it to do that. And you don't need a degree to do that. And so sometime in 2017 and 2018 or so, I really made a conscious effort to say, I think this is something I really want to do. And so this is when, still doing my day job, just trying to figure out how I can learn more. And fortunately, I had the means of being able to leverage classes like through SAMs and whatnot, not only through tuition reimbursement that my employer sponsored, but also just funds out of my own pocket. Just started to accelerate my learning over time. And basically the culmination of my professional investigative experience, in addition to my willingness to learn the technology and the aspects of what makes digital forensics, which is attribution, I eventually found an opportunity at another healthcare organization to do their investigations and eventually make it to their digital forensics team, and which today I'm more or less responsible for the forensically sound analysis during an incident response. So while we may not necessarily look for attributable behavior to a threat actor on the outside, because that's just something may not necessarily be immediate importance, but the process itself allows us to allow our leadership to make sound decisions based on whether or not if we are safe to continue business that is intended for patient care.
Oh, okay. Okay. Wow, I didn't know anything about your journey from before you got into healthcare and doing digital forensic incident response. So that's amazing. And I feel like it also probably your experience has built a lot of empathy along the way. So when you're dealing with especially like a healthcare breach or something along those lines, like you can have empathy towards the people who are impacted or a victim or something like that, or maybe even an employee who is innocent in the situation, depending on what that looks like. So I actually also went to school at the same time, roughly about the same time frame. So congratulations, we went to school at the most expensive time. So I always tell people they're like, oh, why didn't you go and get your master's right after school? And I was like, debt mostly. And I also didn't have a technical background. It's kind of like I would say fidget in tech, I guess would be the best way, because I don't even want to say that I tinkered. I kind of fidgeted with it. So I didn't really have a technical background, and then I I always tell people I tripped and fell into digital forensics. I have no idea how I got here, but the investigative mindset I think is something that is key. That a lot of people, they think they have to be computer science oriented only, and that's really not. Do you have a natural curiosity? Do you like learning new things? Do you enjoy solving individual puzzles? That's how I tried to describe it, and I was like, then you can probably get into it. Um, and the programming piece is not something that's required, but definitely helpful, right? Um, so I know a lot of people who I've worked with, and also myself. It was a requirement in my college program to go through and learn a program. But I didn't actually use that program in my professional career as an examiner. And I wish I could go back now in time and learn Python in college rather than the language that I learned. But um, it is what it is. So, what does your typical day look like?
Um, you know, with incident response, we kind of hope that incidents don't happen. So it's more or less just preparing for the next one, just in case it does happen, or rather when it does happen. But just as a snapshot, most of the days are just filled with meetings, just the standard meetings with other people, making sure we get things done according to our growth and roadmap, if you will. Reviewing and preparing for the next incident is always on the top of our mind. So we're always looking at our documentation. We have what's called an incident response plan to make sure it aligns up with our current processes and look for opportunities for growth. And then from a digital forensic standpoint, basically getting the data, not necessarily depending on a SIEM or security event incident management system, but also, or even just looking at triage, just how do we even get the data to begin with? And that's kind of the lens I look at it. Like we might have a security of operations center being able to look at telemetry at an endpoint through whatever EDR technology that they're using. But for me, if they don't get what they want to get, I need to be able to get the data in its raw format. And so that's what I spend some of my time on, quite a bit of time on, just make sure that whatever processes that we have still works. Like it might have worked 6 months ago, might have worked last year. I would take a look at that. We might have new capabilities that we're looking for. I'll give you a good example. What I've been working on this year is looking at how to have a great sound forensic sound process for acquiring and analyzing Mac OS systems.
Oh,
We have a small population of that, but as small as they are, they still are a prominent
they're your pain point.
subset.
They're your
Yeah,
headache.
and so
Yeah.
I spend a lot of my time on a regular basis just figuring out, okay, what's my status of what my end goal is, like for the collection, examination, and analysis of those machines. And everything's documented accordingly because you don't remember things and you want to take notes and articulate the progress that you made throughout the time. And you might occasionally consult on a potential security event and, if necessary, investigate or initiate an incident response.
So what is your favorite tool or tool that you're looking at right now to examine Mac OS systems?
I think from the classes I've taken so far through Summary and through SANS, great opportunities, by the way, that I've been able to leverage and had the privilege of doing so. Most of that's native. And so I've got the capability where I can just use a Mac to analyze the Mac through the command line interface. So you don't necessarily need specialized tools to be able to analyze it. The acquisition piece, however, requires a little bit more planning. And fortunately, because we're all in-house as an organization, we have access to keys. We don't have to worry about brute forcing it. If we need
Oh
the
yeah.
administrator password, that's stuff that we can do. Now, fortunately, there's been some really cool stuff that's going on in the open source community. And I don't want to get his name wrong, but I want to say his name is Andrea Lazzarato, and he has authored the program Fuji, which is really cool because what it does, it basically obtains or gives you options to obtain live logical data from both Intel and Silicon machines. And it's free, which is great. And because in our environment, we have access to the administrative password, we can get in and collect it as needed. And so that's a great tool for us to use just to acquire that machine. And we have a few select EDR options for us to be able to collect data from those live machines as well. But collecting data over the wire is not always the best thing for us.
How, when you guys are collecting data, like how much data is it? Is it like a couple terabytes? Is it like a couple gigs? What does it look like?
We
Nothing is a
try to,
couple gigs anymore. I don't even know why I said that. It's like a couple gigs. Wow, that would be so nice.
well, if we're just doing it over the wire, we just want to try to keep it to a couple of gigs just so that we can do proper scoping. We're not collecting the whole machine. By that time we might have something in our SIM. We might see something, but we say, hey, we see this this artifact. Is there another artifact that might substantiate whether or not this is more concerning or not? And that's one way we need to collect the data because it's not being ingested centrally. We just need access to the machine. And so we might collect a few megabytes or a couple of gigabytes of data in that scenario. But if there's something more warranted that we need to look at, then that's when we probably physically pick up the machine and do a deep dive at that point.
Okay. So what are the most common incidents you see? Are
Well,
you allowed to
fortunately,
talk about it?
well, generally, I mean, I can speak in generic terms because we don't experience a lot of incidences because we are in-house and most of our tool stack is relatively mature in that regard. But from what I see personally in our environment is mostly just third-party vendor risk issues where we deal business with other organizations because in order to make sure that healthcare is affordable, we might find opportunities with the businesses that do that work better than us externally. And so we might hire those organizations to do that on our behalf. And that could not just IT, but also just patient care oriented care. And they might have been impacted by a security event. And when they're impacted by a security event, we have to assess whether or not, if we're impacted from a cybersecurity perspective, like, do we have any direct connections with them? If they were infected with malicious software, is there a chance or an avenue that can make it into our environment? Do we need to sever connections down? Are there impacted businesses as a result of that compromise? And so us as a team, that's what we're involved in. We're making that assessment on any potential risks related to any connections with that organization. And that's what we
So,
see on a regular
so like
basis.
roughly when you're doing that, what does that timeline look like? Like, is it a
Um,
couple weeks to go through that process? Couple days? Like, are you
it's
less than 24 hours?
usually just a couple days just to make the preliminary assessment on what our exposure is. I mean, just giving you an example, we work really closely with our cyber threat intelligence team that does a lot of that searching on our behalf. Like, did they see a compromised credentials for a user that's employed at our organization? Do they did they see data from a compromised organization that we deal business with? Do they also see any news or open source intelligence that says, hey, this company was compromised and they deal business with our organization? So when that happens, we make that assessment, and it takes maybe a couple of hours to go through our process, and we make a determination whether or not if we need to initiate an incident, which in our case, an incident is where we start bringing people in of those business owners of those applications to say, hey, this is what we have, this is the situation. Can you tell us more about your application and what data that might be at risk if the data that we share with them was compromised? And so that usually just takes a day or so. It's not a long, drawn out process, because it's not like a forensic investigation, if you will. These are just risks that involve our data.
Yeah, it sounds like you guys have a really well documented process and like readiness program to handle all that. So that's good because you said that you're experiencing like mature systems and processes already put in place. So I guess how do you like analyze a organization's readiness level? Like for especially for a forensic investigation. So you're a mature organization, but for an organization that's just starting out, like where do they start? How do they assess themselves? What does that look like?
Yeah, speaking personally, that's worked out for my experience and worked out for our organization. Having a plan ahead of time is really handy so that you're not necessarily just going off the fly of what to expect and you're trying to get resources during an incident. That's like the worst time to take care of
Yeah,
that. I mean, just think about in
stressful.
your own personal life. You had something happen in life, you didn't plan for it, it's stressful. It's no different in the corporate world, except it involves more people. So having an incident response plan is helpful. And is it documented? Is it in accordance to your existing processes? Is it tested regularly? And an incident response plan is really outlining everyone's roles and responsibilities ahead of time, so that there isn't that friction that can occur in an incident where people are concerned and people panicking. We have a plan. We're going to enact this incident response plan that we've practiced, that we've implemented and documented, and see through that we base our actions based on facts and what is currently in front of us, not based on our emotions, not based on perceived concerns. And it's something that's written down and everybody is familiar with. So that would be like the one thing that I would consider that would lend itself to a more mature organization for readiness to handle an incident. And then just from the forensically sound analysis component of it, I imagine you want to make sure that you have processes that support like the capability to collect, examine, and analyze the data. And that could be from a endpoint like a Windows machine, Mac OS, Linux. Do you have processes that you've already implemented that's consistent with your environment? Like, is your Windows machine BitLocker? Do you have the access to the keys? Do you have any other encryption that's considered legacy that you need to make sure you have access to those keys and the ability to, and a process to decrypt that information? And in my most recent case, being able to access and analyze Mac OS machines. You need the administrator password to really do anything. Have you tested those processes? And then, you can look at it just not only from a disk forensics point of view, like, do you have that ability? Maybe you could go further than that. Do you have the ability to analyze memory? Like, for same thing with Windows. That might be a little bit more standard nowadays, but if you try to do like Linux, there's a process for that. But to be honest, I haven't have a really good process for that I've done considerably well consistently, because with Linux you need a specific I'm not going to be able to recall it since I haven't practiced it, but you basically need specific symbol files. I might be even saying this wrong, but you just need something specific to align with mapping the processes within a Linux sample to be able to do your analysis. And with Mac, at least with the more recent modern Macs, there's no capability right now unless you pay for software like, well, I think Complexities is the only organization that I know that has the means and ability to do Mac memory forensics for silicon devices.
Man, yeah, and talk about like the emotional piece, like you just going through that. I feel like I just kind of was like, I I don't know this one thing either, and I'm like, if I was on like a situation, like how do you handle that? But I guess if you're dealing with the same, like you should know your environment, right? Obviously, um, and it's not as stressful if you're planning for it constantly, which sounds exhausting, but also. I think you get used to that, right? Like the constant evolving of the SOP and the incident response documentation that goes into that.
I think it's something that you have to. I don't think you ever get used to it. I think it's just something you manage. Like the incident response piece is a responsibility I only recently taken on within the last year or so, and so for me, it's understanding the pace. That I wouldn't say the pace is really that horrible. We're very fortunate to have an organization that supports us. So I
Oh,
really
good.
can't say
Yeah.
that it's horrible, but it's something that you do need to have in the back of your mind to not neglect your own personal health just because you've had these other things going on. It's something you have to prioritize um, and be conscious of. It's not something that you think, oh, I need to exercise to take a walk. It's because it's convenient. You need to actively take control of your life and be able to do those things so that in the event of an incident does come up, um, you're not suffering from a health
Yeah.
standpoint.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And there is such a thing as, incident response fatigue. A lot of these organizations don't have enough resources, so their responders are constantly reacting to situations, and then they're completely burned out, or they're working like 12, 14-hour days consecutively for months and nobody even realizes it. So, um, it is extremely important to like consciously have breaks. I keep looking over here. I have this like little timer that I keep on my desk, just to kind of remind me like I've been working for this long, like take a breather, walk away. I don't know if you have any of those tools and stuff like that, like when you're actively working a case, but you can be 100% consuming, and then you realize you haven't moved in 4 hours from your desk. So try to
Yeah,
do that to prevent.
we actually have something like that in our organization, and I find it very annoying. But I can see the
You do?
because you can see this pop up. Like I'm right in the middle of something and like a really like deep in thought, and I see this pop up in my corner. I'm like, okay, gotta stretch, ignore. I shouldn't
What
do
does
that.
it say? Does it
Uh,
say like, hey, you've been
yeah,
working for?
it's enterprise software that regularly reminds you to get up and stretch, and it gives you these like tips on what you should stretch. Like do get up, stand up, you know, lift up your arms, things like that. So it's good for the workforce, but I don't. I probably should practice more what I preach when a computer reminds me. But um,
I
that
feel
is an
like that's the
age.
reminder I get in my car. I hate it. It's like, hey, do you need to take a break? And I was like, obviously not. I'm still driving. Like, we're not there yet. I do not need to take a break, but it is
But
annoying.
but back to the organization's readiness. I think the most important thing, and I probably don't say this to my own teammates as much as I should, but it's having a collaborative environment with your own team and other subject matter expertise is really key because I obviously don't know everything. I mean, give you that example on what I was trying to say about Linux memory. I don't remember all the facts off the top of my head, but maybe someone else does. And there's other subject matter that I'm not very familiar with, like networking, right? And then we have other things that I don't know about, which is a lot. But the bottom line is like, if you have a team that's collaborative and you have an environment that supports that, and then you can build on those other teams' expertise. Like in our organization, we have automation, detection, security engineering, cyber threat intelligence. We have our own internal IT assets and by business owners that know a lot of things about their own application. Even our SOC. Those are your sources of information that I can leverage and have leveraged that really, I think, is a good sign that a organization is mature in that way, or at least in the direction of going in that way. So that would be the last thing I would mention about assessing an organization's readiness to handle a incident.
Yeah, I actually did incident response early on in my career. It was my first digital forensic job, and it was in a SOC environment, and the different Tiger teams that they had to support you was pretty amazing. Like the pockets of information they had, the knowledge, the just the wealth of knowledge that these people had, and like the types of incidents and things that they have seen and experienced in their careers was amazing to be just surrounded by. So I never felt in that environment that we were going to fail as a team as long as we collaborated as a team. The only time we would fail or not perform well is if nobody was talking to each other or like gatekeeping information. It was never good. So totally understand that. So I wanted to ask you this because I went to I went to DEF CON years ago, and this was one of my favorite talks still is they were talking about hacking different healthcare systems, and specifically they were having people hacking morphine machines, which was kind of crazy to think about. Like you're in the hospital, you're on morphine for a reason, but then like hacking a machine to like get additional morphine was just a concept that I just could not comprehend. I was like, why would anyone want to do that? Um, and then the other thing too is they had spoke about, hacking individual pacemakers, which I didn't really think about as it being like an Internet of Things device. But in healthcare, you see all sorts of medical devices. So can you kind of explain like the complexity that's involved in forensic investigations when it comes to these types of systems?
I don't have a good answer for that because it's not something that we experience on a day-to-day basis. In fact, I think for at least a couple of organizations that I've worked for, our approach to that is make sure that they're not connected to the internet.
Oh, yeah.
And so, yes, I can imagine it's possible. And I've read a couple of those proof of concepts, and they are very scary. But I
Yeah.
think that goes with like, let's avoid having to analyze them to begin with by making sure you secure those assets and making sure that they're controlled in a way so that you can mitigate those risks. Like if it's connected to the internet, you're not going to have someone from the outside access those machines with a default password. Um, Things of that nature. Now the pacemaker, I don't really know a thing about, so
I thought it
I
was
wouldn't be able to
crazy.
answer
I was
that.
like,
Yeah.
I don't want to know. And like this was I don't know if it was a legitimate, I can't remember the talk like because it was years ago, but something along the lines like it is possible and all this other stuff. And I was like, well, why would a pacemaker have to be even attached at this point? And they're like, well, like Bluetooth, sending the data back to the medical providers. I'm like, there's got to be a better way, right? Like also you just need one smart individual to figure it out, and then all heck breaks loose at this point. So we don't need that. I was reading about it and I was like, oh, this is still a thing. This is still a vulnerability that people are still exploiting. So it's crazy. But yeah.
No.
So what I guess is the most interesting case, if you can share, that you've seen in healthcare so far in your
Okay.
current role?
Yeah. Before I answer that, I just want to add one more thing about the internet things and medical devices that just came to mind. Um, you know, because they're segmented away from the network, or at least hopefully they should, and they're not connected to the internet, you might still have other risks associated with them, like having a third party maintain those devices. And
Oh
so
yeah.
you might have a third party come on site and they might bring their own toolkit that has a USB drive, and they might use that USB drive for other organizations. And so that's probably something else that, that's probably more of a risk than like say having them connected to the internet if they, well, I'm not sure if one or the other is more of a higher risk, but it's still a concern to have a third party from outside with a USB drive that's not managed that could potentially have malicious software on it unbeknownstly to the tech and then introduce that to your environment. I think that's something that is concerning, and something that if we had had an incident involving those things, those are basically, in our experience, those are just regular outdated Windows machines. I think the last one that we've had was still using Windows 7. So these are devices that are managed by third parties too. Um, let's see, what was it? I think the main thing that I was more or less just trying to articulate involving medical devices is that oftentimes they're not necessarily owned by the hospital.
Oh yeah.
They're managed by a third party, and when they're managed by a third party, they're going to have technicians that will maintain those devices, and they might bring you a USB drive to maintain those machines. And then on those USB drives to maintain those machines, it might contain malicious software, which might introduce malware to your environment. And in that experience, because not our they're not our assets, that we still more or less need to make sure we get authorization from that organization to be able to do any analysis to begin with. So I would imagine that would be the most challenging thing with those machines, but more or less not. More often than not, they're just a basic Windows machine.
Yeah, I feel like that's a challenge with what you were talking about earlier too, is like when you have a breach or something like that, or a third party breach, you need to see like how you're impacted or how your systems are impacted. It's always a risk when you're not in control. Like
Yeah,
you can only control what's in your environment. So introducing new things or not being able to control people in general of like what they're doing on their machines is frustrating, definitely an end user issue. So um okay, so most interesting case. What is it?
I'm not sure if I really have an interesting case, but I can probably mention interesting themes, um, where when you're looking at a case, I think a lot of the experience that I've had where it has made it interesting is that one, there's something new or novel, and I think when the novelty of a problem might come with novel solutions and techniques, and I think those are the really cool times that you experience that makes it interesting. Um, and I really can't think of anything specific, but generally speaking, when you see something and you make assumptions, that might lead the organization to one direction, but if you take the time to analyze the issue, and come to find out that might not be the issue at all, you save the organization a lot of time and effort going in one direction. Um, but that's not really interesting. So I'm having a hard time thinking about
No, it is
what
interesting. It's an
interesting is.
interesting topic to discuss because I think a lot of people, when they come across something new and novel, it is terrifying, right? It's a lot of like, I don't know what to do with this, or I don't know how to handle this situation. So, knowing how to calmly approach something that's new and novel, it's like, okay, then it sounds like you have a process put in place for that.
Yeah. I, I could think of a case. It wasn't necessarily digital forensics related, but it had to do with exfiltration of information. And so in this particular case, we were concerned about there's an allegation that someone had access to protected health information, and somehow it got shared with other parties. But
Mm.
this data what didn't belong to our local organization. Um, and we did, when we reviewed the information, it didn't appear that anybody in our area accessed that information. So I think the interesting piece is that if you're able to look at the data, you figure, okay, where could this data have possibly come from if it didn't come from us? And so when we did the analysis and understanding where that data might have been, we figured out, okay, maybe it came from this other system that we don't own, but maybe it came from the system that someone else owns. And then if you just following that path and that pulling that thread, if you will, we spoke to our business partners in that area that would have control of that data and say, hey, we have this concern here brought forward to us by a patient. Can you take a look at it? Here's a timeline. This is what we believe it is. This is the system, what it believes to be, and we believe that these type of people are involved. Take a look. So once we give them that information and give it to that other business partner, like, hey, yeah, we see something kind of unusual. This patient information seems to match up with what the allegation is. So I'd probably say that would probably be the most interesting investigation in my mind, where you're acknowledging that you might not necessarily see something on this data that you might have, but if you look at the data and recognize that there's something different and talk to people that you might know, you might be able to leverage that information to actually get a lead.
So from a non-technical perspective, I would say like the key takeaway from that experience is learning how to talk to people and collaborate with other individuals that are
Oh, for
involved,
sure,
including third parties.
for
So
sure.
there's a theme here, collaboration, information sharing. So that's good. So what do you think are the most, I guess, common pitfalls that you see organizations struggle with? Is it communication? Because we're on that theme, but is it something around like the compliance piece? Is it something around like the readiness, not being able to collaborate with other groups?
Communication is a big deal when it doesn't happen. You may not. I mean, if you have a good environment where we have people communicate, it's great. But when that doesn't happen, it really is not fun. So I would say that can be a pitfall that I've experienced. And I think another one too is organizations get so large and it can get so complicated. And in that complication, you start to lose track of where data is. And I think that's one of the things that we have to constantly remind ourselves, like when we're building out new systems and when we have new resources out there. What tends to happen is you build those resources, and you kind of forget about it. And so, well, I would say that one of the pitfalls is not being constantly aware of where your data resides and how you use it. And then, you know, maybe future you might regret that because you might have that system online and you don't know why it's there or how it's being used. And so you have to do a lot of work to catch up to understand what that data might be and how it might pose a risk to your organization. So I guess more or less it's the pitfall is just not knowing where your data is, what you use it for, and having an understanding of um, why it exists.
Yeah, and there's multiple different ways where data, like what you're saying, data can be missed or data you don't know it's missing because you don't know what you have. And I think that a lot of organizations find that way down the road, like when it's too late, right? And then they're notifying individuals like, hey, there was a data breach, but we didn't know it happened because we didn't know of this one system that we had that contained all of this data because there's no one tracking it correctly or nobody's being accountable for it.
Great summary. Yes.
Yeah. So, um, where do you see digital forensics evolving in the next, we'll say 5 or 10 years? 10 years feels like forever. We'll just stick with 5.
I mean, at least in my world, I can see it being more or less the same, but we're probably involving more third parties. Um, and I think that's just more of it, less of the effort to make sure that we find ways to make sure we get the care to patients where they are at. And sometimes and it should be outside of the hospital. And so when you think about digital forensics, you might be thinking, I might be thinking that where will the data reside if we're trying to take care of them outside of the hospital, outside of our physical environment? Will it be on um, a wearable? Will it be another telemetry device that they might borrow or buy that has interconnectedness into our environment? Um, how does that data get transferred? How does that data reside? Where does the data reside? Is it in someone else's cloud? Is it our cloud that we manage? Um, and so from a digital forensic standpoint, like how do you monitor that data and how do you protect it if it involves so many other third parties? So I can imagine something more along the lines of that, maybe less just forensics and more cloud. Um, and I also think about how augmented reality might come into play within medicine at least, because I know that with medicine, from what I'm aware of it, using augmented reality for like physical therapy or just basically allow clinicians to practice using different techniques, or at least practice, if you will. Um, I know that they're looking at that technology to see how care can be improved, and I'm thinking, how can it be tracked? How can it be documented if they're actually using that to provide care? Um, I'm not that knowledgeable on how they're implementing that, but that's just something I think about.
Yeah, I just read something about how they're doing augmented reality for surgeons, right? For heart surgery and brain surgery and stuff like that. And I was like, I didn't even think about that, but it's genius, right?
I
So
mean, how
using
cool
it.
is it to have a tool at your disposal to be able to facilitate more accurate and more timely care? I think that's really cool. But on the other hand, because it's medically related, how, is it documented? Does that pose a risk to a healthcare organization? Do they do it right? Do it wrong? And then, from it looking at it from a standpoint, if there was a concern, how do you get that data out and present it in court, and how do you interpret it? That's more on the medical side, but
So for medical type stuff, maybe you don't know this, I don't know, but
probably not.
how long does it take for new technologies to get adopted into healthcare systems because of the risk?
I know that just to pilot it, it doesn't take very long. Um, but in actual practice, I'm really not sure because I don't necessarily see everything that gets implemented into fruition into actual practice. I mean, example, I know that for chronic conditions, just technology in general, for chronic conditions, having the ability to remind patients when that they should, take their blood pressure, to get the readings of their blood sugar levels, those things are important for patients so that they can report them to their provider on a timely basis. And and having phone calls is difficult because you're spending resources to remind the patients to do X, Y, and Z, being compliant with that process. But with technology, even just 10 years ago, they were thinking about using avatars, like having an app to remind you, say, hey, today is such and such day. You should be doing these things, and this is when you should be doing them. And having an avatar that has a like a human characteristics that reminds you might be more inclined um, to comply with the schedule, right? And so that was in pilot 10 years ago, from what I recall. And I'm more or less just still seeing this more or less the same thing today being put into practice.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
Now, I'm not sure it's because of just they're different organizations and one organization is doing something that's different than the other, but I just saw it the other week and I'm like, wow, that's something I saw 10 years ago. I thought this was like a common thing, but it wasn't. So, but to
Yeah, I
answer
think
your
it takes
question,
a
I really
little
don't
bit.
know. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I also think that like the wearables, right? At least I know my watch is really annoying. Like I have reminders set up here and there, but I just set up a wearable for my stepdad actually,
Oh,
because he has to track certain medication he takes and what time he takes it. So like setting all that stuff up. So it's a more manual process, but I would have loved an app that would have synced directly with his doctor's office to do all of these things. So that way I know that I'm, not at fault for not doing it correctly or whatever the situation is. Um, but he wears that thing religiously and, tracks his progress in his heart and stuff like that. And he can now sync that health data to the doctor's office. And they can, check on him from time to time. But ton of resources saved in that process. Because I can imagine him scheduling an appointment, walking in, going through the full thing just to kind of do like a quick, yep, everything looks good. So
yeah,
more
that's
efficient.
awesome. Anything that makes their patients' lives easier to help them be more compliant with their own care, that's awesome. Like they don't need to see a doctor in the office, right?
Yeah.
If we
And
can,
I
if
was
you could,
shocked that he wanted to do this too. This is a man who doesn't like going to the doctor, so and he hates technology. I'm like win-win for everybody.
absolutely, that's awesome.
So, oh my gosh, so I could get off track and all this other stuff, but I do want to ask you, it's a holiday, you know, festive podcast. I tried to be festive. My virtual background decided to crash right before you joined, but you are super festive. You have your virtual background with your Christmas tree and rocking horse. What shirt do you have on? What
So,
are you
oh yes.
representing
So I know
today?
that you asked for something festive, and I just can't really bring myself to wear an ugly sweater. So I have this shirt, which is like the Home Alone shirt with
Awesome.
Marv and Harry, and
I
so I
love
have
it.
that because I know that people like Die Hard as a Christmas movie, but Home Alone is equally better. But
Is that your
anyway,
fave?
yeah, Home Alone's probably my favorite. Oh, Die Hard's great, but when I think about holiday spirit, I think of Home Alone more than I think of Die Hard. But that's just my
Yeah,
opinion. And then just to throw that out there, I put this on there just as a last minute thing. I have that on my hoodie.
extra festive.
Something
So
last minute.
do you have any favorite holiday traditions?
Um, s- yeah, I think some things that my family has been doing for quite some time, probably since I was 12. So that was a while ago, and we still do it today. Is as a family, we would take turns picking out new restaurants that we've never eaten out before, and then we go to that
Mm,
place, and then we go as a family, and we do that around Christmas, New Year's time as part of
oh,
our
that is
annual
nice.
tradition. So one, it gives us an opportunity to try something new. And these restaurants are usually something a little bit more nicer on the nicer side. So, as a family, we collectively go and take turns picking out restaurants, and it could be anywhere in California. It could be Northern California or Southern California, depending on where we're living at the time. And so we do this every year, and I think that's one of the coolest traditions. And then as we got older and started making our own income, when it's our turn, we would pay for it. And so that's something nice that we've done as far as tradition goes. Um,
That's that is nice. What's your favorite? Do you have a favorite meal that sticks out to you?
um, Probably the most favorite meal I had was this venison that I had at a restaurant called Ella's in Sacramento. Probably the most memorable one, just because it's one of my first fancy meals, if you will, as a kid. You're having a bunch of these kids and sit around this nice white cloth table in the fancy restaurant. It was a really cool experience, and so that was probably my most memorable meal for me.
Awesome. Well, that's awesome. I we just sit around and eat junk food, and it's probably my favorite. So it's like really the only time I could just get to like not care and just gorge in like the amount of insane like those little those little shortbread cookies that come in the blue tin.
Oh yeah.
That's my jam. No one likes them. I don't
How
know what
many,
my problem is. I could sit down and eat the whole tin.
who do you
No
know that doesn't
issue.
like them? I think that's pretty crazy because those are pretty good.
I think a lot of people think they're boring. They're just sugar cookie. They're just like shortbread sugar cookies. I'm like, yeah, but they're delicious. And you know, I have a coffee addiction and they pair very nicely. So I always make an excuse like, oh well, it's Christmas time, so I might
Here's a gift to me.
overindulge. Oh, look, Santa got me this. So, um, but yeah, I look forward to it every year. And I'm like looking out for the big tins. My sister got me a huge tin one year and it was like it took me a while to get through, but no regrets.
I bet. I mean, that's can't you gotta treat yourself every now and then, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Definitely enjoy the holidays. So, well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I'm glad that this is your first podcast. Hopefully it was a good experience.
No, thank you for having me. It was a great opportunity, and just to get myself out there and maybe just talk about a little bit what I do, and hopefully I did your podcast justice.
Absolutely.